This video was brought to you by Nebula.
Hello friends, my name is JJ, and don't hate me for this, but I am quite a fan of Funko Pops. Funko Pops are of course these highly collectible plastic figurines of just about every character, celebrity, and brand in existence. Originally, the Funko Corporation specialized in making these things, bobblehead dolls. These are a very classical style of American toy, dating back to at least the 1920s. In those days, they were usually made of clay, because plastic was not a common thing yet. In the 1960s, bobbleheads of popular athletes became a big fad as the American professional sports industry really kicked into high gear, and baseball, basketball, football, and even hockey players became some of the biggest celebrities in the country. The toy tradition got a second wind in the early 2000s when bobbleheads entered a more self-consciously kitschy, ironic era, with plastic dolls of somewhat less heroic characters like politicians, D-tier celebrities, and boomer-era corporate mascots. America's bobblehead industry has always been centered in Washington State, and in 1998, the Funko Corporation was founded in the city of Everett to specifically capitalize on the kitsch bobblehead trend. This included making the controversial decision to not make any athlete bobbleheads, but instead double down exclusively on pop culture stuff, and it seems to have worked. Funko's wacky wobbler brand bobbleheads steadily grew to dominate the market during the 2000s, and at some point they realized that no one really cared about the bobbling, they just wanted little big-headed figurines. So in 2010 they released a new line of non-bobbling toys called Funko Pops for pop culture, and the rest is history. The popularity of the Pops has made Funko an extraordinarily successful company, pulling in $1 billion a year and having now produced around 30,000 different figurines representing over 1,000 different pop culture properties, including movies, bands, video games, comic books, anime, food, and ironically enough, sports stars. Funko claims to be the world's largest proprietor of licenses, which makes sense, given officially licensed products are basically the foundation of their whole business model. Something interesting is that Funko remains an independent company. It is not owned by either of the big two American toy conglomerates, who have spent much of the last few decades gobbling up every other toy brand across the country and now appear to be on the brink of merging with each other. Funko does make Pops of some of the iconic toy brands of the big two, but they do this just by buying the rights the same way they do for everything else. Another interesting thing is that Funko is very much not a kids company. According to their most recent investors report, the average Funko customer is 36 years old, which is why I, as a 39-year-old, am talking to you about them today. When I first moved into this apartment back in December, it came with a little wine rack type thing, capable of holding 10 bottles. And since I don't drink, I thought it would be fun to fill it up with Funko Pops instead. But not just any Funko Pops. I was thinking that I should try to get 10 that best reflect my favorite topic, which is the American cultural canon. So let's go through them one by one and talk about what these lovable chunks of plastic represent and why. I promise you, it will be interesting. Alright, so first up we have Ronald McDonald, the iconic mascot of the McDonald's Corporation, one of the most successful fast food companies on Earth. Capitalizing on the burger and fries craze that swept middle America after World War II, McDonald's opened its first chain restaurant in a Chicago suburb in 1955, before proceeding to spread across the country. The idea of a chain restaurant managed by a single corporation was a relatively new one at the time, and McDonald's is credited with helping pioneer many of the conventions of chain companies we now take for granted, such as national ad campaigns on the newfangled medium of television. Getting a clown to push burgers to kids on TV was a scheme originally dreamed up by McDonald's DC-based restaurants. And in 1967, Mickey D's HQ rolled out a national ad campaign introducing a modified version of that clown character to children across the country. In a short period of time, he became one of the most recognizable corporate mascots in America, and given the expanding number of McDonald's's around the globe, a leading symbol of American commerce and capitalism as well. On that note, this Pop is not just a generic Ronald, but is actually based on a particular Ronald McDonald sculpture they often display outside of McDonald's restaurants in the nation of Thailand. You can see he has his hands put together in a distinctive Thai greeting gesture known as Y, which I think makes this an interesting little artifact embodying several distinct themes of Americanism. Next up, we got Mickey Mouse, who may or may not be just as famous as Ronald McDonald. I have heard different things over the years. Mickey is, of course, the mascot of the Disney Corporation, the largest entertainment company on Earth, but he remains a popular cartoon character in his own right as well, having appeared in literally hundreds of animated shorts, movies, video games, and more. He was a purposefully simple-looking character created in 1928 by Mr. Walt Disney himself, who also did the voice, with his simplicity reflecting the fact that in those days, making animated cartoons was quite a complicated, labor-intensive process, so there was a bias towards making characters that were easy to draw. One of the things that made Mickey particularly noteworthy, even back then, was that he appeared in one of the first cartoons with sound. An animated short called Steamboat Willie that is still probably one of the most famous cartoons ever made. This particular Mickey is done up in a rainbow because it's supposed to be a special edition for Pride. Pride, of course, being an increasingly popular annual celebration in America centered around Americans who are part of sexual and gender minority communities. The association between rainbows and Pride is usually credited to a guy named Gilbert Baker, who created a special rainbow flag to fly at the 1978 San Francisco Pride Parade, which was and is one of the biggest in the country. This one here is a Darth Vader snowman. You can see it has a bobbling head, so Funko hasn't completely forgotten their roots. Darth Vader, as I'm sure we all know, is the main villain in the very popular Star Wars movie franchise, now owned by Disney. He was introduced in the very first Star Wars film, which is now called Star Wars A New Hope, but when it first came out in 1977, was simply called Star Wars. It was written and directed by a guy from California named George Lucas, who is often considered one of the most important men in the history of American film, and probably one of the most culturally influential Americans of the last century or so as well. The Star Wars films are usually described as telling a relatively straightforward tale of good versus evil, with the dark, ominous, hulking Vader, who was played by a British bodybuilder with his voice dubbed in by James Earl Jones, today considered such an iconic symbol of evil that his face has even been carved as a gargoyle on the side of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. The later sequels and prequels do depict him as a somewhat more nuanced character, a guy who was destined for greatness as a young man, but ultimately falls under the spell of what is known as the dark side in Star Wars jargon. This particular Funko Pop is supposed to be a Christmas edition, with the idea of using snowmen as a Christmas symbol usually credited to the late Victorian era. This was a time when the British were starting to become a lot more sentimental about Christmas and started commemorating a lot of supposedly traditional Christmas time activities on greeting cards and things, including building snowmen. A lot of white middle-class Americans were still taking their cultural cues from Britain at that time, so much of this particular flavor of Christmas sentimentality was imported stateside a full scale. Of course, in a particularly American context, the snowman as a symbol of Christmas undoubtedly got its biggest boost in 1950, which is when the hit single Frosty the Snowman debuted. Here we have Captain America done up as a gingerbread man. So Captain America seems like a pretty big deal right now. He's one of the main characters in the mega hit Marvel Avengers movie series, which audiences can't seem to get enough of. Also brought to you by Disney. For a while, he was being played by Chris Evans, but in the next movie, it's going to be Anthony Mackie, right? I don't know a lot about movies, so you're going to have to help me out. The original comic book version of the character was dreamed up back in 1940 by two New Yorkers, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, and was created explicitly to be an uplifting symbol of American patriotism during the bleak years of World War II, as you can see from the cover of Captain America #1. Captain America #1, incidentally, also happens to be one of the rarest and most valuable comics in the world, with a mint copy selling at auction last year for $3.12 million. The big gimmick of Cap is that even in modern stories, he's always supposed to be a guy from the 1940s. He's just been frozen for some extended period of time. And this allows him to always embody a certain old-fashioned spirit of heroism that only gets more intense the further we get from the World War II era. Gingerbread, meanwhile, is a very old style of cookie that was brought over from England. Before sugar was as common as it is today, people tended to season treats with spices, with ginger-flavored cookies being one popular example. This guy is also supposed to be a Christmas edition Funko, and it is precisely because gingerbread is so old that it also got bound up in the same British Victorian Christmas nostalgia industrial cultural complex that we talked about earlier. This is an anthropomorphic can of Coca-Cola, the most popular soda in the world. It was developed by two guys from Georgia in the late 19th century, which was basically the golden era of soda development. John Pemberton, who came up with the original syrup recipe, which was initially made from the extract of coca leaves and cola nuts, and intended to be a kind of medicine, and Asa Candler, who bought the recipe and had the bright idea to mix it with carbonated water and make it into a soda instead. Candler was also the founder of the Coca-Cola Corporation, which today has risen to not only be one of the largest soda companies in the world, but due to its ownership of several other drink brands, one of the largest beverage companies too. Alongside Mickey and McDonald's, Coke is probably the single most recognizable symbol of the global success of American business, but has historically often been used as a symbol of American cultural imperialism as well. Partially in response to this, in 1971, Coke debuted what is quite possibly their most famous TV ad of all time, which is what this guy represents, the "I'd like to buy the world a Coke" commercial.
I'd like to teach the world to sing. Sing with me. Perfect harmony. Perfect harmony. I'd like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company.
The New York Times referred to it as a masterpiece of naive multiculturalism. This guy is Frankenstein, specifically Frankenstein as portrayed by the British actor Boris Karloff in the 1931 movie Frankenstein by Universal Pictures. You can tell because he is holding a daisy, which is a reference to one of the most iconic scenes in the film. Frankenstein was originally an 1818 novel by the British writer Mary Shelley, but Hollywood adapted it into a significantly different story. In both cases, it is about a mad scientist named Dr. Frankenstein who builds a man and brings him to life. Though in the Hollywood movie, this is made much more gory and disturbing than the original novel, with Dr. Frankenstein making the man out of stitched together body parts that he dug up from a cemetery. The Hollywood Frankenstein is thus a distinct enough character that Universal Studios still claims him to be their unique copywritten character, as opposed to something in the public domain. Although, given how ubiquitous Frankenstein is as a generic creature of American folklore these days, I would say they have pretty much lost that argument. If you want to learn more about this, I suggest checking out my award-winning video on the history of American monsters. This Frankenstein has very bright green skin. It's not entirely known why we think of Frankenstein as being green, but my theory is that it probably has something to do with the often unnatural colors that were used on movie posters of the time. These uniquely vibrant colors, however, are what are sometimes known as day glow colors, which are produced from a kind of dye that was developed by two brothers from California in the 1940s. Day glow technology was heavily used by the US military during World War II, then adapted for civilian use in the decades that followed, like so many other things. This guy is a Blockbuster video VHS rental cassette box man. So the technology to play movie tapes at home using a video cassette recorder, or VCR, was invented in Japan in the mid-1970s, with VHS, or video home system, actually being a specific Japanese brand of videotape that was so popular, its name became synonymous with the product itself, sort of like Kleenex. In 1985, a computer programmer from Dallas named David Cook founded Blockbuster as a video rental chain, largely as a way of monetizing a computer-based inventory system he had developed. It was a system that would use computers to let workers easily keep track of which movies were being checked out by who, and which movies were the most popular and all of that. And it was a very successful company for about 30 years, but ultimately went bankrupt in 2010, in part because it failed to adapt to the age of the internet, in which people were increasingly watching movies at home via online streaming services. Nevertheless, as the king of the VHS and later DVD rental market for so many years, Blockbuster is now a source of considerable nostalgia for people of my generation, for whom trips to the rental store have become this very sentimentalized childhood memory. You can see the little guy is holding a bowl of popcorn. Popped or parched corn was introduced to the early European settlers of this continent by the Native Americans, making it a truly indigenous American snack in both senses of the word. Once movie theaters were invented in the early 20th century, popcorn became a very popular thing to sell at concession stands, mostly because it was so cheap. And to this day, about 30% of all popcorn in America is eaten in movie theaters. Though much like a Blockbuster itself, the movie theater popcorn industry is also in a pretty steady decline as the streaming revolution marches on. This thing is a Beholder, which is one of the most iconic monsters associated with the Dungeons and Dragons franchise. D&D is a so-called role-playing game, which basically entails one guy known as the Dungeon Master telling an interactive fantasy story that the other players have to attempt to navigate. Thanks to the game's huge popularity, D&D is usually credited for playing a large role in helping standardize the creatures and lore that comprise the American fantasy canon. The game was created by two guys from the Midwest who published their first D&D rules manual in 1974, and it contained descriptions and sketches of the many different monsters that the Dungeon Masters could use. In 1975, they released a supplementary booklet with more monsters, including the Beholder. As you can see, the Beholder is a kind of scary octopus-looking thing with eyeballs on every tentacle. Because of its memorable look and status as a character that the creators had invented from scratch, rather than just pulling from public domain folklore, it became a sort of mascot of the franchise, often appearing in the form of book covers and t-shirts and stuffed animals and all the rest. This guy also came with a little 20-sided dice. Rolling a 20-sided dice, or D20, is a big part of D&D gameplay, and the dice have become a common symbol of the game as well. Though they were not invented for it, Gary Gygax, one of the creators, said that he originally ordered them from a school supplies company. This is a bald eagle holding an American flag. It is actually supposed to be a specific character named Eagly from the DC Comics franchise Peacemaker.
Why is your pet's name so unoriginal?
Why are you my least favorite kid in this class?
But I like it just as a representation of two very stereotypical American cliches. The bald eagle owes its status as an American symbol to the fact that it was chosen to appear on the Great Seal of the United States that was designed in 1782. Seals being the national symbol that the Founding Fathers cared about the most, even more than flags, as I discussed in another award-winning video. Going with the bald eagle was actually a somewhat controversial decision at the time. While they are undoubtedly a mighty and majestic bird exclusive to North America, they are also scavengers, and this was seen as unbecoming of a national symbol. Ben Franklin famously wanted the turkey instead. It is interesting that 1 out of 10 American bald eagles is found in Alaska, a place that didn't even join the United States until 1867. Bald eagles were considered very endangered for about 40 years in the late 20th century, mostly due to an explosion in use of the pesticide DDT during that same time. But the conservation efforts ultimately worked, and in 2007, bald eagles were officially declared not endangered anymore, with their numbers having ballooned from less than 1,000 in the early 1960s to over 340,000 today. It remains a federal crime to kill one, though. Okay, and lastly, here is my little Beaver pal. He is an original character that is part of Funko's Nations of the World series. They call this guy Douglas Beaver, and he represents Canada. You can see he is holding a little bottle of maple syrup as well. Does something so ostentatiously Canadian count as a symbol of American culture? Well, I suppose it depends as to whether you consider the nation of Canada to be a component part of a larger continental American cultural civilization, as I do. In any case, the beaver, although not exclusive to this continent, has played a very important role in the history of it, just because there were so many of them here. Early French and British settlers, working closely with the Indians, established a powerful economic system known as the fur trade, which saw enormous quantities of beavers hunted and killed so that their furs could be sold to Europe where they were used chiefly to make top hats. During the peak of the fur trade in the 1720s, it was estimated that a beaver was being killed on this continent every 3 to 4 minutes. It is partially out of the beaver's status as a symbol of the wealth of the New World that there are said to be more places in the US and Canada named after beavers than any other animal. You can see that Douglas is wearing the iconic outfit of a Mountie, an officer of Canada's National Police Force, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The RCMP were founded in 1873 to help bring law and order to this vast half of the continent that Canada had recently annexed. Stories about this era of Canadian history were briefly fashionable in Hollywood, and the Mounties have been coasting on that fame ever since. So there you go, 10 random tales of Americana as told through Funko Pops. So now it's your turn. Let me know in the comments if you know any interesting facts about anything to do with these 10 things, because I'm sure you do. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video, but would you like to see it go on even longer? Well, that's possible if you check out today's video sponsor, Nebula.
Hello, friends. So yes, it is true. I am now a member of the Nebula gang. Nebula, for those of you who don't know, is this very cool online streaming platform where many of your favorite YouTubers like me and Knowing Better and Half as Interesting and TLDR News and a ton of others post ad-free versions of our videos, as well as exclusive videos and a bunch of other bonus content. For example, in this week's video, I analyzed an additional 2 Funkos, but you can only see what they were if you head over to the JJ Nebula page and watch the extended cut of this video. Nebula is also home to a ton of exclusive, high-quality, full-length documentaries that you can't find anywhere else, such as Real Engineering series on the Battle of Britain, or Real Life Lore's 2-part special on the rise and fall of ISIS. Best of all, Nebula is amazingly inexpensive for what it is. If you follow the link in the thing below, you can get unlimited access for only $30 for a full year. Hard to argue with that, eh? It's a big honor for me to be part of the Nebula team, and I'm hoping to make the most of it. So don't delay, head on over and give Nebula a try today.
Exciting stuff. I am excited. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.